Excellent. And I want to thank Camille for connecting with Jonathan and inviting him to talk with us today. It's a conversation that we've been having, so I just want to introduce Jonathan. Some of you may know him. Jonathan, I believe you're a planner for the city of Salem, so local guy. No? Oh, wrong Jonathan.
I live in Salem. I'm on the planning board.
Okay. All right. But you speak extensively about the importance of building cities for people, utilizing smart growth technologies and principles, community-driven placemaking, and how to build strong, healthy, vibrant, and equitable communities. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to you to, share some thoughts on this whole process. And then hopefully we'll have some time at the end if folks have questions. We can just have a discussion about that.
Great. Well, thanks, Dane. Thanks, Camille, for having me. And hi, everyone. I know some folks here. For folks who I don't know, Jonathan Berk, as Dee mentioned, I live in Salem and I'm on the Salem Planning Board, but I am not a trained planner. I'm actually a trained attorney and still do a little bit of that work, but try to stay more on the creative and community building and advocacy side of things these days. So I'll give hopefully a very quick, I think I may need permission to share my screen.
Oops, sure thing, yeah.
But I'll try and give a very quick, like 10-minute presentation on just some of the issues surrounding the housing crisis in Mass right now. I just gave a longer version of this down in the Cape a few weeks ago, so hopefully this also resonates with folks here as well. So let me get that started. So before you really get into discussions around the housing crisis, it's also mobility. And I think when you start talking about housing, the first thing that comes into people's lips is traffic and parking and transit and how to get people around. So I think we really need to kind of look at how do we solve both crises at the same time? And that's a lot about land use and where we put our housing. So, sorry, there we go. So this is a chart and from a study that came out, and they redo this every couple of years, but this came out back in 2021. It shows all trips, train, vehicle across the US and the distance that they travel each trip. So that's going to work, that's going to visit family, that's going to restaurants, shows, bars. And over half are less than 3 miles. 28% were less than a mile. And that's on average across the US, suburban, rural, urban settings. But it sort of goes to show that I think more of our trips than we think can be accomplished by other means, as well as more of our trips can be unnecessary and eliminated and mode shift away from the needs to actually get to your car or drive to get certain things or go to do certain errands. And it's about providing safe options to do that, right? This is a quick example I want to show from our neighbors to the north in Montreal. A 4-lane road going through downtown that was converted to a safer pedestrian space. Protected bike lanes on both sides, something we're seeing more of. I know Salem's been great and a leader at this in the area too, for adding safe bike infrastructure. Obviously, it's had its battles, but it has increased biking in the city, and there's noticeable differences around folks who are actually getting around the city by bike as opposed to driving, adding to traffic and adding to the parking issues that downtown areas may have. And I know you folks in the municipal side of things always hear from the angry folks who hate changes to our streets, but Mass Inc. did this study about 2 years ago and found that 75% of registered voters in the greater Boston area actually support adding protected bike infrastructure, even if that, and the wording was, even if that means sacrificing space for cars and sacrificing lanes for cars. Obviously, that's going to be different in certain communities and it's going to be higher in others, but that is an average across greater Boston, not just the city of Boston and Cambridge, Somerville. So really rethinking housing, right? And I think a lot of what I try to do when I give talks and what I try to do in social media, when I talk to different family members, is really getting folks to kind of rethink the traditional past 70 years of housing development in the US, try to put themselves in the shoes of people in different life situations, different financial situations. So one stat that I think is important to kind of ground ourselves in Massachusetts' current crisis is that we may feel like we're building a lot of housing right now, but we are building nothing compared to what we used to build in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. Back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, we were building about 30,000 a year across the state. That dropped as low as about 11,000 in the 2010s. It's still about 12,000, 13,000 right now a year statewide. if you look at the number in that call out there, 246,000 new residents in the Commonwealth in the 2010s, only 81,000 units of housing. That number is even worse when you start thinking about the number of empty bedrooms we have in the state. I think in Boston, the statistic is that in the 50s, there was an average of 1.4 people per bedroom in the city of Boston. Today, that number is about 0.7. So you can see sort of the way we live and how we live in our communities has dramatically changed as our populations increased as well. So that's even doubled that need for more housing production. And really looking at how we align our housing with the demand, right? People are buying single family homes sprawled out further away from job centers. So we assume that means that that's what everyone wants. It's not the case. And I think that's sort of a false confirmation bias a little bit there too. But numerous surveys have come out that show that 1 in 2 Americans, I think somebody on the phone there may need to mute themselves.
I figure out how to mute everybody.
Not sure if you can do that as well. All right. Thank you. So 1 in 2 Americans want to live in walkable neighborhoods. Only about 1 in 12 are able to, right? I mean, we know there's a price premium in walkable neighborhoods and walkability. We also know that we just have not, as the stats showed, not been building housing in those walkable neighborhoods for a lot of different reasons. Some other research has come out recently, the demand. 79% of folks surveyed by National Association of Realtors this year said it was important to live within walking distance of things like shops, parks, and 53% actually said they prefer multifamily housing. So when you look at the supply side of this, only 27% of the US housing stock is multifamily, and only about 36% over the last decade or so is actually of the new supply being built is multifamily. So there's still that huge delta between what's being built and where the demand actually lies. So what is it, right? How do we get ourselves to sort of a space and a place where we have the housing supply, we have the right size housing, we have the different housing options in communities. And this is one example from the city of Newton. This is an ongoing process right now as they try to come into compliance with the MBTA communities 3A legislation that was passed about 2 years ago. And they're one of the first communities will have to come into compliance by the end of this year. But they're really looking at how they smartly add density to the community in walkable areas. They already have a bit of commercial, a bit of retail, and really looking at multiple ways to add housing, add workspace, add shopping, but also making sure that it's a place that people can get to with options aside from just driving from the surrounding community. And again, the importance of building it in places where you can start eliminating the need for trips, right? When you mix use retail and residential, you can start eliminating, in many cases, 28% of the trips that are taken to this day. And another really interesting study from a group called Urban 3 out of Asheville. This is for folks more on the municipal side or folks concerned about municipal budgets that are being stretched every single day. Definitely recommend taking a look and a deep dive when you have some time into some of their research. But this shows, and I know it looks a little bit scary, so I'm getting into the Halloween vibes here in Salem, but this is the benefit that you see from properties in a more densely packed downtown area, and then the drain that properties on the outskirts of a community take on the city budgets, right? Providing services, providing utilities, repairing roads to service more and more homes in sprawling neighborhoods, providing fire and police out to further and further reaches the community, whereas denser buildings on smaller lots provide a higher return to the city and support the city's budget. And it's really about right sizing our housing supply. When I say that, every community is going to be very different in this, but I think for the most part, when you look at a lot of communities in Massachusetts, the dominant housing unit is single family. In many communities, most of the land, 90% plus, is going for single family exclusive. And it's not necessarily building 50-unit buildings. I think that's really important to get across to folks, is that when you say multifamily, I think a lot of people's minds jump right to the big boxy buildings they see in the Seaport in Boston. There's a whole universe of missing middle housing. A lot of you have probably seen this graphic before from Optico's design out in Arizona, but you can see the ends, which we do very well in the US, detached single family houses and then large multifamily. But there's a whole universe of about 16 different housing types in the middle. So that's duplexes, that's triplexes, that's quadplexes. That's cottage courts, which have become very popular, especially around retirees, downsizing in homes, shared spaces, looking at building new townhomes, multiplexes, things we built a lot of back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, have really kind of gotten away from in sort of that post-war era, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I know folks in a lot of communities hear the opposition to housing. I mean, as a housing advocate, we hear it all the time too. It's not necessarily a majority, and in most communities, it's actually the strong minority that you're hearing the opposition from. So there's a first study I want to reference is a BU study that came out a couple of years ago, surveying who was speaking at public meetings around new development projects. About 2/3 of the folks who spoke at those meetings were speaking against the development. Obviously, this is a in-person public meeting at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday night. You're not getting a broad brush of community opinion from that meeting. A similar MassLink poll recently conducted showed about 2/3 of people were in support. This is specifically on the MBTA communities bill about rezoning to add density around transit stations in communities around Greater Boston. A third of those folks actually said that the bill didn't go far enough and they wanted to see even more density. So I think it's a real sort of polar opposite when you look at who's actually speaking in community meetings versus the broader public opinion, which isn't always able to attend those tough meetings. I mean, I'll say it as a Salem Planning Board member, we don't get many public comments in our meetings. The ones we do are typically the ones that are opposed to projects. And I've seen that firsthand over the last year. So it's really something to really consider and think about as some of the opposition that comes in that you're not necessarily hearing from the folks that are in support of these projects. And just one quick reference for Abundant Housing Massachusetts. This is a nonprofit housing advocacy organization. We advocate for really adding more housing supply of all types. So that's traditional, affordable, subsidized, affordable. That's also market rate. Really looking at the different levers we can pull at the State House in terms of rezoning and state level zoning changes, but also looking at how we support local advocates on the ground in communities. So we do have a lot of resources. We have staff. If you have folks in your communities that are sort of talking about organizing groups to support new housing in those communities, we're happy to work with them, coach them, and support them on how to speak about these issues at different community meetings, but really sort of be that voice for what we would call pro-housing movement across Massachusetts. So that's it. And I really just want to give an overview and really sort of have more of a dialogue and a conversation from here. If folks have questions or comments or thoughts, I mean, I'm always happy to hear opposing views and anything I said as well. So.
Thank you, Jonathan. I thought that was terrific. Well, I just want to kind of bring it topical. We had a planning board meeting the other night where an over 55 development was under review, and it had its detractors, also had its supporters. I guess it brought it home to me that you know, even a kind of an attractive project like this, which is going to provide homes for, you know, folks who are either retired or approaching retirement, and they're one of the groups that we're concerned about. You know, teachers, firefighters, young workers, but also seniors having an affordable place to live. In this particular case, the argument against the development seemed to come from abutters. But even a project like that, which is going to have a lower impact on the traffic, on schools, on certain other services, has these detractors. And sometimes I think from a local government, we get the feeling that you know, if you can't support something like that, we're lost. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good. I mean, yeah, it's a great question, and it's.
Could we stop sharing? Can we stop sharing the screen so we can see each other? Or unless there is more to the presentation?
Nope, that's all. Sorry, Kelly. No worries. Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I was at a planning meeting in Swampscott a couple of weeks ago. I'm still there, and I made sure as a good son that they get involved in some rezoning efforts in Swampscott for more housing as well. You're only hearing from a certain segment of the community, and I think I went up and talked to one of the planners after, and she was really discouraged because it was a Tuesday night at 6 o'clock. They had a great presentation. There were 20 people there. I think I was the youngest person by 15 years, and I'm 37. So in that room, and the town has a lot of young families. They just can't show up to those meetings. So from our perspective as housing advocates, our real goal has been to try and mobilize those folks in the middle ground who are not showing up opposing. Because a lot of times, as you very well know, there's just not a lot of things you can say to get people to support housing who are so vehemently against it. I mean, Swampscott had a project in Venice Square recently that the community wanted an independent traffic study to show that the traffic wouldn't be bad, or was going to be worse than what they thought it was going to be. The independent traffic study came back and didn't show something they liked. They wanted a second independent traffic study. I mean, it's one of those things where I think there's a certain segment of population that just will not support new housing or that broader change in communities. And I think it's really looking at how you actively, and it's kind of what we're trying to do here with abundant housing, is really trying to mobilize that passive majority. Those folks that are not showing up to oppose, they're not showing up to support. They support housing. They have a life. They have other things to do. They already own their home. They may be busy. How do you get them to care enough and get them passionate enough to actually start these groups? And we just had a meeting this morning. We're seeing groups forming in Needham and Fitchburg and Framingham, really all over the state, trying to mobilize people. And they're folks that started with one person in the town that just said, I support housing. How do I help? How do I get involved? And they've grown into 5 people and 10 people. And I think that is, in my opinion, that's going to be what it takes, because better than I do. Some folks you're just not going to convince to support anything. I mean, if you talk about parking on a project, right? It's you don't have enough parking. You have more parking, and the response is it's going to be more traffic, so we don't want it. And there's just no assuaging some concerns from some folks. There's some folks who are just going to be against the housing projects.
Well, I just want to balance it out with some good news from that same meeting, that there was a project approved that night on Central Street, which is right in the heart of our downtown. And I think it's a desperately needed project. I think it's 150 plus units, if I'm not mistaken. In any case, that'll be for, that'll be for young families, some workforce housing, and desperately needed because we need those people to live, work, and shop and eat in our downtown. It's desperately needed. So that was some good news that came out of that meeting.
Yeah, it's great to hear. And I know I've been looking into kind of I moved up to the North Shore last year, back to the North Shore last year, but looking at what Beverly's done with Rantoul Street, and I know it's been controversial, but you are hearing stories from folks who sold single-family homes because of the buildings that were built on Rantoul Street and were able to downsize while still remaining in their communities. And I think that's another big piece of the puzzle on unlocking family units in this region, is that you have a lot of folks that have empty bedrooms that want to stay in their communities. They just don't have an option. And when I said right sizing housing supply, it's sort of how do you provide those options for people at different stages of life, after different life events, to remain in those communities.
And something I'd like to add to the conversation, I am in the demographic that you're talking about that's not coming to the meetings. And I do currently live in Peabody. My parents currently live in Peabody. And one of the things that we're seeing is a lot of houses being built in Peabody that are targeting a much more affluent demographic. And I know I have several friends who grew up in Peabody who would love to stay in Peabody. It's a great community, but they can't afford it. They can't find something that they can afford. A lot of people I know are commuting a significant distance, which is contributing to the traffic problem that you were alluding to. But I think there is a bigger issue that we need to address at the same time as housing. Like, one of the pictures that you showed was very reminiscent of the development in Linfield at the marketplace, because they've got the condos and the very walkable mall at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But A, those condos are very expensive, and B, they still don't have access to public transportation. So something else, Beverly and Salem have just a minute amount of public transportation because they do have the commuter rail. Peabody doesn't have anything. So, I mean, we don't even really have a reliable bus route. So if we could address the concept of transportation and less need for driving around and building that type of community, I feel like a lot more people my age would support it, especially if we could have like a 2 or 3 bedroom condo in that community and also be able to move our parents into a 1 or 2 bedroom condo in a similar space so that we can still keep an eye on the upper, because we're at this point we're being torn between our parents and our children, and balance, and that's a great balancing act, and that's where all our time goes, and we don't have time to attend these meetings. So just food for thought.
Yeah, no, really, really good points. I mean, the traffic one, especially the affordability piece is, I mean, that's going to be one we grapple with for decades, right? I mean, we're so far behind. I put up that graphic to show that we haven't been building enough housing in this region for 40 years more. So, I mean, every year we waste not doing enough in terms of changing our laws around that is just more time. So there's all these arguments around like it's a supply and demand problem, but it's going to take us decades to catch up to actually write that number.
True.
So I was going to add, we do
Yeah.
need stopgaps like inclusionary zoning and a number of other housing support programs in place to kind of fill that gap. At the same time, we need a new supply of all different types of housing. We need more luxury housing. We need more market rate housing. We need more affordable at 120% AMI. We need more affordable at 60% AMI, at 20. Like we need more housing at every single level. We just need to make sure our policies are in place that they are producing at every single level of the spectrum for that. So
Jonathan, to your point, I think that that's the biggest hurdle that I've seen that we face, that when people talk about housing, they immediately go to 100% subsidized housing, shelter, homelessness. And that's not what the state needs at the moment to alleviate the crisis that it's going through. Obviously, 100% subsidized is part of that equation. We have people in extreme poverty that need the lift in order to secure the housing. But we also need housing for people who are working 2 jobs and still can't make enough money. People who are working that don't qualify for any type of subsidy under any type of sky in Massachusetts. You know, the newlywed couples that both of them have $80,000 jobs, yet they can't afford to buy a property because they don't make enough money, and they don't qualify for any subsidy because they make too much money. So I think that the luxury living, we need them. We need the tax bracket for them to support the economy. So I agree with you, and I think that that's what I see too, and that's the dilemma, that the general public just thinks about housing in one lens, which is 100% subsidized housing, and that's not necessarily what we need. To that point, I think that we should work hard on preserving the shelter units that we have in every city. And I don't think that that's the focus, but we need to focus on that too, because if we don't preserve the current stock of shelter units we have, then we're going to have more housing issues of people living in the streets. So I don't think that that's something that the administration is necessarily looking into, funding more of these things. Just because we have currently the migrant situation, there's a lot of funding coming, but not necessarily to do capital improvements, for example, which is the case that I'm dealing with right now. But if the city of Peabody only has one provider for homeless people, then we should probably be supporting that provider to be able to provide as much resources as they can so it doesn't disappear, because then they're going to be in a situation where they're going to have a higher volume of homeless people. So,
Yeah, you make really good points. They're all really hard conversations. We're having them in Salem right now with a new shelter that's being proposed that has the community in that neighborhood up in arms. At the same time, those are the same folks that are calling the city complaining about the homeless encampment that's growing on the waterfront. I heard it in a coffee shop yesterday. I had to bite my tongue pretty hard, but 2 women who were talking about they can't believe they're putting this large structure in their neighborhood, and then the next sentence, this homeless encampment is ridiculous. We got to get rid of this. And I wanted to scream because I'm like, you cause and effect right here. You kind of put the pieces together. You just didn't connect the dots.
So Jonathan, to that point, could you maybe talk about, you mentioned the Abundant Housing Massachusetts and how they help groups change that conversation or bring that conversation to the community. Can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we're young, right? We started in 2020, I think was our first year, and really just started getting funding for some of our work pretty much the last 18 months or so. Right now, we're heavily invested. We have a number of grants at our disposal to help communities that are implementing the MBTA communities compliance. So rezoning around that bill specifically. So we're working with a number of communities now to reach their compliance date by the end of this year and the next year. It's different. Every single community is very different. You have some communities that are city councilors, and that's the body we have to work to convince. Some towns that are town meeting form of government, which is a whole other animal, as all of you know, which is a much different story in how we're trying to build. Those are the communities we're really focusing a lot of our time on, because we think the communities that have city council understand the burdens if they don't comply. It's gonna be the ones that have town meeting vote that don't really understand what the penalties will look like and how they'll impact the community. So really working to build, like I said, finding those 3 or 4 folks that are the environmental advocates in town, that are the equity advocates in town, and getting those groups together. And that's been one of the best sources of sort of local support for housing, is existing grassroots groups that have already started around other issues, bringing those folks together, bringing people out. I mean, it's been amazing how quickly some of these groups have grown, because I mean, I hate to say it's folks who have moved into the community recently, but I think a lot of the support in these communities is coming from folks who have recently come to those communities, and they just went through the housing crisis, the housing search themselves. They spent 5 years trying to buy a home. They think it's ridiculous. I think for folks who haven't experienced trying to rent or buy a home in this region for a while, maybe a much less directly personal, less connected to that crisis. So it's how do you mobilize folks who have a real passion because they just experienced it behind the sport.
So two things quickly. One, I think perhaps we need to change the titling, frankly, it's marketing around that conversation, because Caroline is right. As soon as you say housing, I know in my circle of friends, people's blood boil, because we assume that we're talking about the low income that are just on full subsidy, and we're not talking about people who, to Carolina's point, are making good money and just frankly can't afford it. So potentially marketing around that conversation to get more people involved. Actually, this is directed at a much larger demographic. Everybody should come and be a part of the solution. The other end of that is, years ago, I had read a study that was done in one of the big cities in Utah, it might have been Salt Lake City, that they had done a survey of how much the homelessness problem was costing taxpayers in over a period of time. And then they did a survey of how much it would cost to build an apartment block to house the homelessness problem, and do the comparison of how much that apartment block would cost them over time versus how much the supportive services for the homelessness problem would cost them over time. And they determined that some people would get into this block and be able to work themselves out of it, and thus be able to go to more traditional forms of housing. And some people would just stay there forever due to a number of other issues. But it was still less expensive to have that than to deal with the homelessness problem as it traditionally is addressed. Have we done anything like that in Massachusetts?
Not that I'm aware of, but you do bring up really good points, Kendra, around the terminology that's used. Even when I was asked to speak here today, I was asked to speak about affordable housing, right? What does that mean? That word affordable housing means 10 different things to 10 different people.
Yeah.
Is it capital A affordable? Is it lowercase affordable? Is it affordable for me? Is it affordable for the average community member? I think other terminology issues, we talk about rent control. I think calling the bill on Beacon Hill right now rent control was the worst marketing they ever could have done for that bill, because it's rent stabilization. It's not rent control. And rent stabilization is something that has been implemented in a number of states recently. It basically says you can't increase rent more than 10% a year, which is, anything more than that is insanity to begin with. But calling it rent control for a lot of people who are going to be asked to vote on that now brings back memories of 1970s and 80s rent control policies that were failures. So a lot of it does come down to terminology. I think the homelessness issue directly, I'm not an expert there. I don't want to speak directly to it. I don't know what we've done in terms of state policy around it. I think there's probably folks in this call who have more experience there than I do. The only thing I will say is that, I mean, I've lived in Boston for years near Mass and Cass. I'm in Salem now. We have a growing homeless population here. I think I've seen it in Lowell. It's growing across the state, and it's growing across the country. I mean, you'll see in Brattleboro, Vermont, there's a large homeless population up there. It's not just a housing issue. I think that's important to reiterate too. There are a lot of other issues that are kind of getting at a head in some of the homeless issues in different communities. But in terms of direct funding to the homeless population in Massachusetts, I'm not sure what is going on. Again, it's not something I'm not a housing policy expert. I just sort of speak on more of the transforming community attitudes.
I mean, I assumed it kind of hadn't been done. The question is, could it be? And could that be an avenue to pursue to potentially address an issue? That's really all I'm suggesting.
Beacon is a tough place these days to get a lot of things done. And I think that it has been frustrating for a lot of people. There's some great pro-housing state reps and senators that are also frustrated at the lack of just sort of willingness to recognize that we are in a housing crisis, and the status quo of only addressing an issue on Beacon Hill every 4 years cannot continue. So.
Can I add something to this?
Yep.
As somebody who's on the ground realtor every day, I'm seeing a trend that parents are looking at properties to buy their children now, when their kids are not even old enough to live on their own, because they are concerned that by the time they get to the age that they're going to be able to buy a home, that they will not be able to afford it. I have 2 children. I mean, my son is an HVAC tech making $120,000 a year, and he can't afford to buy a house. I definitely think that there should be a trend towards more like townhouses. So I want to have a house. I'm a new first-time home buyer. I want a house. I want a yard. I want my kids to be able to play there. I don't want a condo, let's say. But how about we have more townhouses that you share a house with somebody else? It makes it more affordable. You still have the yard. And I just think that would be a great solution moving forward for the people that can't afford to buy a single family home on their own. And they want to have a little bit of a yard or something for their dog or their kids or whatever. But I just think it was pretty alarming to me to see that the parents are out there shopping for their children that are teenagers, and they just said, what if I buy a house now for them, or a condo or something, so that when they get to be old enough that I will have something to sell them, that because the prices are just insane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I could just jump in here, what I'm starting to see, my name is Steve Roussel, and I work for Salem 5. I'm a mortgage guy. I'm starting to see a lot of cities do master plans, and even parts of a city. So you have East Boston doing a master plan for the first time in 30, 40 years. You have Everett, you have Suffolk Downs, you have Revere, Chelsea. All of a sudden, even Lynn, a lot of what's going on now is that there's master plans that I think are going to try to plan to say, all right, as a town, as a city, as a neighborhood, let's put a plan in place now of where we want to be a few years from now. One of the comments I wanted to make, and I'm surprised, and I wanted to get your opinion on this, is, you're a planner. New York City got hit with 9/11 and destroyed down in New York City. Even before that, the investment people, the bankers, that city would actually close at 5 o'clock at night. So even though before 9/11, everybody would go in there, making a lot of money, but then at 5 o'clock, the place would be empty. So this has been going on for 23 years. I'm seeing Boston now all of a sudden saying, hey, can we repurpose these buildings? Can we start rezoning? Can we use federal money, state money, city money, public-private sort of investment? And, with the master plan of all this, so it's been 23 years, let's say, since 9/11. How come we don't have that playbook from New York City? And how come we're not bringing that to Salem and to these like Peabody's and this other places, Jonathan?
Yeah, there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of topics you touched on there. And let me try and hit first on The master planning is great. I think the housing production plans that some communities are starting to do is great. It's going to have to be a regional thing. I think we've left housing production up to 351 cities and towns for too long and had no real state level production plans and goals. It's going to have to come at some point, whether it's now or 5 or 10 years when it gets even worse, to a state level production plan and implemented and controlled by the state, whether you like it or not. I mean, you're seeing it in California now, you're seeing it in states like Vermont, Montana, where they're gradually saying towns have to allow, essentially, I'll call it eliminating single family zoning, but allowing duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes on really every lot that has a hookup to water and sewer in a number of states. I think we're going to start seeing more of that in Massachusetts because we have to. To the sort of doom loop idea that you're talking about in downtowns, I think downtown Boston is an example of failed zoning policies that we had years ago, similar to the housing crisis. Downtown, by the idea of separating our commercial from a residential, was sort of a throwback to a bygone era where we had factories and people didn't want to live near factories because obviously there's pollution coming out. You don't want to have homes there. I think that continued through like planning of these big commercial downtowns like Lower Manhattan and Boston and San Francisco. So why didn't we do anything about it before? Because I don't think most cities thought we needed to. That's for a city like Boston, most of their tax base is coming from downtown office buildings. That's paying for the rest of the city's services. At that point, they're like, well, it's working. Let's not rock the boat. I mean, I think there were warning signs from cities like Detroit. There were warning signs from cities like Baltimore years ago that saw cities that were solely relying on like a couple industries to support their entire downtowns, their entire economies, that we should have kind of seen it coming in Massachusetts, but we didn't. Downtown Boston will be the last place to recover from this, and I think it gets worse before it gets better as more offices don't renew leases and people don't come back as much as the T gets worse and commutes take longer and traffic gets worse. That being said, I think downtown's loss, and friends in the city of Boston will kill me for saying this, I think downtown Boston's loss is our gain in cities like Peabody and Salem. And you look at the gateway cities of Massachusetts and how they originally started, those were economic hubs in the towns around them. Yeah, they supported those were the homes that supported those industries and those communities. I think getting back to that will do a lot to help our housing, to help address issues of equity and inequality in our region, but also to help address traffic and transit and pollution and environment by bringing more investment into those communities in terms of jobs as well that we haven't seen in a long time. So,
Jonathan, one other thing, if I could, mobility, right? So let's say you're a couple, and let's say you have 2 or 3 kids, right? Which is kind of big, right? 3 kids are big. Well, let's say you have 4 or 5 rooms. So now the kids go out, they move, they go to college, they start their own family. Now you're an older couple like myself, and now you got 5 rooms, right? And with the rates being the way they are, let's say you have a 2.5% to 3% mortgage, and you have all the space. Back before these rates going up, you'd want to downsize to like a 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom. Do you think, is there a way to create mobility where, if I'm that single person and then, I'm in a 1 or 2 bedroom and then I get married and then I have a kid, I go to a 2 to 3 bedroom and then I get to the 5 bedroom, but then as everybody leaves, I want to go down to like the 2 or 3 bedroom. Do you see how Massachusetts is going to handle that mobility for people to go up and down in different stages of their lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're touching on sort of one of the major pieces and major causes of our housing crisis right now is that people are immobile. I think we're one of the most immobile times in American history because there's no housing supply. Like you said, everyone's locked into low mortgage rates. No one's moving, no one's buying places. People feel like they're stuck in these big homes. They're expensive. And like I was talking about before, folks want to stay in their communities and downsize. We don't have the options. We didn't build that housing supply for so long. So one way to get that housing supply essentially unlocked and get those bedrooms. I mean, the guy gave that stat in Boston where you had 1.4 people per bedroom. Now we have 0.7 in a lot of communities in Eastern Massachusetts. We probably have 0.4, 0.3 people per bedroom because we have so many empty bedrooms in a lot of these homes that folks are staying in later in life because there's no place to go. And I'm not blaming a generation for that. I'm blaming our housing supply for that and our housing policies for that. We haven't given them a place that they can afford to downsize, to have that mobility. So when we say right-sizing our housing supply, it's creating smaller homes, smaller townhomes for people to start and get into communities. It's creating condos and apartments for people to downsize later in life when they don't need as much space. It's creating an opportunity when somebody has a divorce and they want to stay close to their kids to find a place in that community. I mean, so many different life events you don't contemplate, that we need to build a housing supply to be more flexible than it has been, which is, I mean, you look at the stats in a lot of communities, 90% plus of buildable land is single family only. It's R1 zoning only in those districts. That is killing us, especially when a lot of that is near transit and near our downtowns.
Also, to question, is the instability of mortgage rates, to Stephen's point, is that contributing to the housing problem? Because I mean, I know my parents have like a 2-point-something% mortgage rate, and they don't want to move because I looked yesterday, it's 8% right now. And I mean, can anybody realistically afford to buy? Because at a $300,000 house, that 8% rate versus the 3% rate bumps your payment from $1,700 a month to $2,300 a month. That's a lot.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it's a huge impact, and I think a lot of people have been on the sidelines for a while waiting for that to drop. The problem is a lot of people have been on the sidelines for a while waiting for that to drop. So as soon as the mortgage rates do drop, and we haven't really been, I mean, construction has encountered the same rising interest rates that everyone has to buy a home. So housing starts have dropped dramatically in this region recently in the last 6 months to a year. So you're going to see, as soon as those mortgage rates drop, more people entering the market and the prices are going to skyrocket. So unless we can address that supply issue.
True. But is there anything that can be done to address the stabilization of mortgage rates?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Is that even a thing?
I don't know. I'll leave that up to Stephen.
It's out of our level.
You know, here's the idea. And I've been beating the drum on this, okay? You have hospitals that are expanding. You got traveling nurses coming from all over the country, making top dollar. But yet these hospitals are not building housing for nurses and doctors. You know, that's a problem because now the people go into the neighborhoods. You're at the airports, okay? You have flight attendants. You have airline pilots that now are renting in the neighborhoods because the airports don't have hotels. You know, they need housing at these airports because they're seeping into the neighborhoods and making rents go up. Another example is you got these college dorms. You got MIT. You have Harvard. Harvard has more money than God. Okay. They got, $60 billion. They got to build housing. They got to build dorms for their students, whether it's BC, BU. I think you can hit this on the supply and demand side with these sort of things, colleges, hospitals, airports, because what's happening is it's in the neighborhoods, it's creating rental issues and even Airbnb. Why would somebody want to rent to a family for $1,500 when they can get these flight attendants, maybe 20 of them, and they come in and they rent out rooms and they're in there like 2-3, days a month, but they're getting $5,000. I mean, how does someone with a normal $120,000 income for, I think it was Cindy that said for her son his age, how does he compete against that?
On that, a couple of things I want to touch on. So on the student housing, yeah, I mean, that's a massive issue in Boston. The city's been pushing universities to build more housing. And a lot of states have had this. The problem is, once they try to do that, you do encounter that NIMBY opposition that will fight the student housing in the neighborhoods. So it becomes this full circle of a lot of universities have been building a lot more housing. I know Harvard has an ungodly amount of acreage over in Alston. They're going to start building a lot more on in the next few years as well. When you start talking about hospitals, and I was just talking to when I was on the Cape for that conference, talking to the housing folks in Nantucket. You have restaurants that are building housing for their workforce. I don't love that because it becomes sort of a form of like indentured servitude when your roof is tied to your employment. So you want to go ask for a better work condition. Your boss is like, well, I'll kick you out in the street if I fire you next week. And I think that becomes dangerous. So yes, there should be funding more housing. I get concerned when you start tying that directly to your employer. And your income, your job, and your house is now all reliant on that. They have you by the barrel. And it's sort of a dangerous position to be in. I mean, the Cape's a great example because 50% of the workforce in the Cape has to commute over those bridges every day. On the islands, you have people who are taking the ferry 2 hours in the morning every day because they can't afford to live on Nantucket. I mean, the Cape's economy, I think, I don't know how people realize how perilous it is down there, but they're sort of like in an existential crisis, and they're kind of the canary in the coal mine for Massachusetts, where they are 5 or 10 years ahead of us in terms of the housing crisis. We're getting there in Eastern Mass, especially, where you're going to have people that you already do have people that have to super commute to get to jobs, barely afford car payments to get these jobs because they're spending 2-3 hours a day and a couple tanks of gas a week just trying to drive all the way in to work at a job that's barely paying them enough. So yeah, it's scary. This is why I kind of wish folks on Beacon Hill were actually, and I will give credit to the Healy administration and Kim Driscoll being in Salem. It's one of the reasons why I moved here. She is phenomenal in terms of housing policy, and that's one of the reasons why she ran for statewide office, is because of seeing what housing was doing to folks in Salem and how hard it was for her to change it in Salem. So I am hopeful. I'm less hopeful about knowing the track record of Beacon Hill and getting things done, but we'll see. There is going to be, I think in the next few weeks, you'll see a new housing bill coming in from the Secretary Augustus's office that will have, I think, a number of changes around zoning, but also around building codes and financing for new housing as well. So I'm not sure what's in it, but I'm hearing good things. So we'll see if it passes. But
Berk, did you want to say something?
No, I was just going to say, to touch on Stephen's comments about master planning. So we're just starting our master planning process in Peabody, and I'm glad to see it. There's at least 3 of the steering committee members on this meeting. So I think we have to have these conversations going through the master plan process, and basically take a real hard look at what we need and what we want, how we want to grow in the next 10 years. And we really need to bring these up to the topic and talk about these, and not whether we have answers, but come up with some ideas and thoughts about how we can improve and move forward.
here.
And you know, just to comment on why we haven't done anything about this, is not, housing issues are not new. Boston has been experiencing this forever, but I think that this new administration is hyper focused on this issue with the migrant crisis. Is exacerbated with the people who are, you know, substance abuse is exacerbated with the closure of, you know, beds to detox and Long Island shelter. It's exacerbated. So I think that right now they're really we have an administration that's a lot more vocal and a lot more open to looking at solutions for this crisis than the former administration. This is not new. Boston has been gentrified for the longest time. Lower Roxbury with Northeastern University. I don't know if you've been around, but all of the new buildings that Northeastern is building used to be housing projects. So where were all these people sent? I have no idea, but it's thousands and thousands of people. This is gentrification at its best. If you go to Nubian Square right now, which is called Nubian Square by the administration, all of that has been gentrified. East Boston has been so this is not a new phenomenon. I just think that this administration is a lot more vocal. Even the new office on livable communities, which was just kind of reopened because the former administration had actually closed that. We didn't have.
I think it hadn't existed for 30 or it had been a while. It wasn't the big.
It wasn't exactly, but there was no appetite to look at this and the way we're doing now. So I think that you're absolutely right, Jonathan. I think that Kim Driscoll, because she lived through the issues in Salem, is very hyper focused on housing being a human right, and looking it through that lens.
And I think just to add one point to the previous administration, I do think the 3A MBTA communities bill was the biggest zoning change statewide we've ever seen in Massachusetts. And to their credit, it was a combination effort between the administration and the legislature on that. But I do think, and I know there are some town staff here and city staff here. I mean, everything I hear from communities is that we know we need more housing. We know we need it for the state. We know we need it for our city, for our tax base, for our population, for our local economies. But it's just so hard. So hard to get it through. And I think for a lot of communities that I've talked to planners, and they kind of wish the state went further with 3A and made it less of an option, and just said, you know what, you have to do this. There's no choice. And there kind of is, it basically is now mandated. I mean, I think the language with the AG's office has basically said that it is now mandatory. I mean, if you don't comply, it's not just a loss of grants. There is going to be a lot worse in terms of punishment for communities that do not comply. But that being said, it's still left the door open too much, I think. So future changes will be a little bit stronger, I hope. And you get into that issue, that thorny issue of local control and state control, which will be a fight as well.
Something to consider on a statewide level is I really don't think, to your point about Nantucket, I really don't think we can differentiate between the transportation problems and the housing crisis, because the two are intrinsically combined in terms of commuting time to wherever jobs are. So if we put some time and energy into improving the state's public transit infrastructure, we may be able to kind of disperse the housing problem, because if there was a way to get from Worcester to Boston in 30 to 45 minutes, or from Springfield to Boston in an hour or less, I think because there's a lot more space out there. I mean, I grew up in Peabody. I live in Peabody. We've been looking at houses in Chicopee and South Hadley because frankly, we can't afford it here. But that commuting issue is still a major problem, but there's a lot more space out there. Whereas here, we're looking at taking down buildings, repurposing buildings, trying to find land, converting what used to be conservation land into housing developments. And that very NIMBY attitude, we're still seeing that because there is limited space. So if we add the transportation piece to the housing conversation, that may change the picture.
Yeah, I agree. I think the one concern I have is folks who oppose new transit-oriented housing because the T sucks. That's what they'll say. Like, the T's terrible, so we
then
can't
improve it.
I know, and that's what the attitude has to be. It's like we have to live in a world where we think we can get the T right and get it fixed and build the housing. We can't sit back and say we're going to wait to build the housing until we fix the T.
Or not hike up prices for new ways of transportation, like the ferry, who went from $2.50 to $7,
Right.
$5 round trip to $14 round trip, being very cost prohibitive for people in Lynn, for example, or people who were going to Lynn to take the ferry in to the city.
Yeah, exactly.
See, Jonathan, one of the last points I'd like to make is that, and maybe I don't have the data, I might not, but I went for a bike ride where I saw the new green line that goes from Leechmere,
Somerville,
Medford to
Union Square.
Yeah, it goes all the way into Tufts. And I went up and down one way, up and down the next way. I'm like saying to myself, oh my God. It's like I'm seeing all this industrial space and I'm seeing the building, I'm seeing the development, right? And I'm seeing across from the Science Museum where they basically put a whole city across from the Science Museum. I mean, these aren't affordable housing units, so can the state do something? Because, if you build a transportation, they're going to come, and it makes it so much more attractive for someone to go from Medford all the way into Boston, probably within about, I'm guessing, probably 20, 25 minutes. Is there something that the planners can do that could, like, how you have set aside so much for affordable housing or Section 8 housing? Can they do that in these bills?
You mean the bills that are funding the new transit projects?
Although what I'm seeing on, what I've seen just from Medford into Leechmere, apartments that are going for $4,000 or $5,000, homes that are going for, 1.2 million bucks. These aren't, affordable 40B units that I could help finance. It's the jumbo stuff that how does someone making $120,000, you know, buy something that's at 1.4?
Yeah, I mean, Somerville, just speaking as that example, I think their inclusionary policy is now at 20%.
Yep.
For new developments. The IZ policies or inclusionary zoning policies are important. They're important to study and make sure that you're putting a percentage that is not going to stop housing development. So I think like we're having a conversation now in Salem about, I think we said 10%, and there's some folks that are pushing for 20 here. And my concern with 20% in Salem is that it will stop development in Salem. So 10% of 500 is more than 20% of zero.
Yes.
So it's important to make sure you're using those policies with a scalpel. So if it's 12.5%, let's do 12.5%. What's the number that we think will get it to a point where it's still feasible to actually see development? Because we're asking the private sector to build affordable housing with that.
But see, I think it has to be in that master plan. It can't be for that one-off project and, you know, you know what I mean? One project is not going to get you that 10% or that goal of affordable housing. I think it has to be in the master plan. It has to be baked in. And I think it's, again, you know, municipal, city, state, federal. But sometimes, you know, the city, the state, and the federal, they're on different pages.
But Stephen, there's something important that also, I lived in Somerville and I moved to Lynn. I'm a homeowner in Lynn. I rented in Somerville, and part of the affordability concept that people need to understand is that when you have a unit that's $1 million, the affordability concept, it's maybe that reduce that unit by 25%. It's still a $750,000 unit. So your $120,000 income is not going to make anything into that unit. So it's still not affordable to a lot of people. So people assume that we have affordable units, it's highly discounted, that it's going to be 10% of the cost. That is not the case. Otherwise, the production will stall. Nobody is going to be able to build houses that you're going to have to discount 75% of the cost. Or they would have to jack up the price and make it $1.2 million because that money is going to come from somewhere. And it might be from the buyer that can afford that 1 million. Maybe he can afford another 200,000 on top of that 1 million. So I think that we have to, that's another part of that education that we need to do with people, that affordability is not an all to end, like a solution for all. Because if you're creating units that are $2 million, it's still very not affordable to me. And it's a good way to pass legislation locally and say, yeah, we're creating these units with affordable components. Yeah, affordable for who? So I think that we also have to do that part of that education about what affordability actually means.
Yeah, and we actually created a residential overlay in Peabody, and during the discussion, we have inclusionary zoning, and that's 15%. And we said, well, this would be 20%. So some of the councils want to increase it to 25% for affordability, but we're hearing that the density to build these units, it's not going to make it worth it. And like you were saying, Jonathan, that we're going to get to that point where people are like, it's not even worth building it if we can't. We need to make some money. We're happy to give you affordable units, but where's the break-even point? So and that's what it comes down to. We have to build more units, and then we can create more affordable units.
Yeah, and the conversation here is going towards a hybrid of 10% plus a density bonus for buildings that get. I just approved a 170 unit project that had 20% affordable. Just that was a developer's choice. There's currently no requirements. So, I mean, it's when you get in those bigger scale buildings, it is possible to have a higher percentage. But I think I do like the idea of that hybrid model of a set base percentage plus a density bonus. Now the question is,
we'll have to see that zoning. I like to see that.
We'll see. Hopeful this year, but who knows? And it's perpetual election cycle.
I mean, one of the things that's happening right now is the Massachusetts Housing Partnership in gateway cities like Peabody. Peabody is one of 29 gateway cities. If someone is making less than 80% of HUD median income, they can get a 10% second mortgage and have no payment on that second mortgage. So that right there would expand how much they could qualify for. But also, if they're making over that 80% of HUD median income, but over around 135, they can still get down payment assistance of $15,000. So I think you're starting to see the state and the cities identify, where they need to, put their resources in to try to make an unaffordable situation affordable.
All right, we're bumping up against 12 o'clock, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time because I know we're all very busy people. So Jonathan, thank you for this conversation. I think it was a great starting point for us. You've given us a lot of things to think about. I'm sure you'll be hearing more from us because it's a big issue. And there's a lot of, as we've uncovered today, there's lots of different pieces to the puzzle, and there's no one broad stroke to accomplish it. But I want to thank you and thank everybody for joining us today.
Thank you.
Jonathan.
Great conversation. Really
Thank
appreciate
you.
it. Carol.
Have a great day.